February 1st, 1943. The airbase in Algeria was quiet except for the low hum of wind brushing across the sand. Mechanics and engineers stood in a loose circle around what was left of a B-17 bomber. Its wings were drooping, the metal skin torn open, the tail section resting several meters away, as if the aircraft had tried to land in separate pieces. Oil stained the ground beneath it, seeping into the dust. The smell of burned aluminum and fuel still hung in the air. Someone kicked at a piece of twisted metal that had once been part of the fuselage. It clattered across the ground and fell still. No one could quite believe what they were seeing. The bomber looked like a corpse that had somehow crawled home. One mechanic broke the silence. "This thing shouldn't have made it back," he muttered. Another shook his head, eyes fixed on the shredded frame. "Not even for a minute. It should have fallen apart up there." Across the nose, beneath the grime and bullet scars, faded white paint still spelled out its name: All American. The men walked slowly around it, counting holes, tracing snapped cables, touching the edges of metal that had been ripped apart by something far stronger than flak. Every few steps, someone stopped to stare again, trying to picture how this broken machine had stayed in the sky. The reports they'd file later would call it a statistical impossibility. But standing there, surrounded by sand and sunlight, no one needed mathematics. The truth was written all over the wreck. For 90 minutes, this bomber had flown against everything physics demanded. To understand how this wreck became a legend, we have to go back 20,000 feet above Tunisia. Earlier that morning, February 1st, 1943, the sun was just beginning to rise over the North African desert. The base at Biskra buzzed with quiet energy, the kind that came before every mission. Ground crews checked bomb racks, wiped frost from windshields, and fueled the silver giants lined up along the runway. The smell of gasoline and hot metal mixed with the chill of dawn. Inside the briefing tent, the men of the 414th Squadron gathered around a map pinned to a wooden board. A red line stretched from Algeria to the coast of Tunisia. The target, German U-boat pens near Tunis. The same route they'd flown before, same altitude, same risk. The only difference was the luck, and no one trusted that. Lieutenant Kendrick "Sonny" Bragg Jr. sat quietly near the back, running a thumb over his flight gloves. 26 years old, calm eyes, the kind of pilot who didn't need to speak much to be respected. His crew trusted him. They'd seen him make impossible landings and smooth out turbulence like a man coaxing an old horse. Around him, the others laughed and traded small jokes, the kind men made to pretend they weren't thinking about flak or fighters. The tail gunner, Tyrus Cy Weaver, teased the navigator about getting them lost over the desert again. Someone promised to save a ration of coffee for after they got back. It was all routine. When the engine started, the ground trembled. 4 at a time, the flying fortresses lifted into the air, forming perfect rows that glittered under the early sun. From the cockpit, Bragg could see the desert stretching endlessly beneath them, tan and gold, fading into blue haze where the sky met the sea. Above 20,000 feet, the air was thin and smooth. The crew settled into rhythm, scanning gauges, checking guns, watching the horizon. Another mission, another day. Nothing felt unusual, but high above the African coast, the sky was already changing. Something unseen was waiting to fall through it. It was supposed to be another routine bombing run. But the sky had other plans. The formation moved steadily eastward, sunlight glinting off a dozen silver wings. The air was calm, almost peaceful. Inside the cockpit of the All American, Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg kept one hand lightly on the yoke, the other resting on the throttle. Everything felt routine. The steady hum of 4 engines, the chatter of the crew over the intercom, the occasional burst of static from the radio. Below them, The Tunisian coastline shimmered in morning haze. They were approaching the target, German submarine pens carved into the rocky harbor. Bragg called out the order, voice calm. "Bombs away!" The aircraft lurched slightly as its payload dropped, then steadied again. He adjusted formation and began the long turn. Home. It was over enemy territory just minutes later that the sky changed. No one saw it coming. Out of the blinding sun, a dark shape tumbled through the formation, a Messerschmitt Bf-109, spinning out of control. Its pilot was already gone, killed in a previous engagement, or knocked unconscious by damage. Now, the fighter was nothing but falling metal, a 6,000-pound missile with no guidance. The collision happened faster than thought. One moment, the All-American was flying level, her crew relaxed. The next, the sound hit. A deafening metallic shriek that tore through the aircraft like the sky itself had been ripped open. The Messerschmitt's propeller slashed through the fuselage just behind the radio room, its wing carving straight across the body of the bomber. In a single second, 8 feet of fuselage vanished. Staff Sergeant Tyrus Cy Weaver, trapped in the tail, felt the aircraft shudder and twist. Then came silence. No engines, no intercom, no oxygen flow. The line had been severed. He turned toward the front and saw daylight where metal should have been. The back half of the All-American hung on by 3 beams and a few cables, swaying in the slipstream. In the cockpit, Bragg fought the controls. The yoke went heavy, sluggish, like trying to steer through mud. Warning lights flashed red across the panel. He couldn't see the full damage, only feel it through the aircraft's trembling frame. His voice came steady through what was left of the intercom. "We're hit. Stay with me." And somehow, impossibly, the broken bomber kept flying. Smoke drifted through the torn fuselage, curling past loose wires and the stench of fuel. In the tail section, Tyrus Cy Weaver tried to move, but the floor beneath him felt wrong, uneven, trembling, as if alive. He reached for the escape hatch, grabbed the handle, and pulled with everything he had. It didn't move. The collision had twisted the metal frame just enough to jam it tight. He tried again, kicking at it, pounding with his fists, but nothing gave. When he finally stopped, panting through his oxygen mask, the air hissed weakly. The line was cut. Frost crept along the inside of his window as the thin atmosphere bit into his lungs. He could see daylight where the fuselage had been ripped open, 8 feet of empty air between him and the rest of the crew. Weaver looked forward and waved. Through the jagged gap, one of the waist gunners waved back. No words, just that small motion, proof that he was still alive. In the cockpit, Bragg had already made his assessment. The plane was broken nearly in 2. The hydraulics were gone. The tail barely held on. Protocol said to bail out, to save who they could. But Bragg's hands stayed fixed on the yoke, steady, unmoving. His co-pilot looked at him. "We can't hold her much longer." Bragg didn't answer right away. His eyes were locked on the horizon, the instruments flickering red. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, level. The kind of calm that came from decision. "Not while one of mine is still back there." The crew heard him. No one argued. No one even spoke. They all knew what it meant. Every mile they flew from that moment on could be their last. Inside the waist compartment, the men strapped in tighter, eyes on the twisted metal swaying behind them. Weaver was part of their crew, and as long as he was trapped in that tail, none of them were leaving. From that moment on, the mission changed. It was no longer about war or victory or orders. It was about bringing a man home. The All-American was no longer a bomber. It was a miracle stitched together by willpower and metal fatigue. The collision had torn away nearly 8 feet of its fuselage. Only 3 aluminum beams and a few tangled cables still connected the tail to the rest of the aircraft, Any one of them could snap at any moment. The tail weighed more than a ton. By every rule of aerodynamics, it should have sheared off the instant the impact ended. But it didn't. Lieutenant Bragg kept his hands steady on the yoke, fingertips barely pressing the controls. It felt like trying to balance a glass of water during an earthquake. Each small motion had to be perfect. No sudden corrections, no panic. Too much rudder, and the tail would twist free. Too sharp a bank, and centrifugal force would finish the job. Even the air itself was the enemy now. Beside him, Second Lieutenant Godfrey Engel watched the engine gauges, adjusting throttle and mixture with surgical precision. The engines had to stay in perfect sync. Too much vibration, and the airframe could shake itself apart. Too little power, and they'd lose altitude, drifting into thicker air that would strain the broken structure even more. Every second was a calculation, every breath a decision. The cold seeped through the cockpit walls, biting through leather jackets and gloves. Frost gathered on oxygen masks and windows. The intercom crackled occasionally, then went dead again. Somewhere behind them, Weaver was still trapped in the tail. When the men in the waist section risked a glance back through the gash, they saw him, waving once, slowly, through the torn airframe. It wasn't a signal. It was simply proof that he was alive. Bragg's voice stayed calm over the partial intercom. Hold steady, no sharp moves. The crew obeyed without question. They barely moved, barely breathed, afraid that even shifting weight might throw off the fragile balance holding them together. Outside, the bomber's skin flapped and shimmered in the slipstream, like fabric caught in a storm. Pieces of insulation were ripped away and vanished into the clouds. The vibration of the engines echoed through the bones of the aircraft, through the ribs of the men inside it. Down below, the Mediterranean stretched out, cold and blue, scattered with whitecaps. It would take hours to cross it. The crew didn't think about hours anymore. They thought in minutes, then seconds, counting the distance one heartbeat at a time. Bragg adjusted the yoke again, the movement so small it was almost invisible. The bomber responded, fragile but obedient, holding its altitude. He glanced at Engel, who nodded silently, hands trembling over the throttles. Every second, the All-American stayed in the air. The odds shifted further into the impossible. Every minute they stayed airborne, physics lost another argument. The first 20 minutes passed in silence. The All-American crawled across the sky at 200 miles per hour, holding together through nothing but faith and engineering. The crew barely spoke. Even breathing felt too loud. Each vibration, each jolt of turbulence, sent a ripple of fear through the fuselage. The men glanced at one another but didn't say it aloud. They were flying a ghost. Below them stretched enemy territory. The rough hills of Tunisia, carved with canyons and dust. Smoke still rose from the bombing run far behind them. If they went down now, they wouldn't make it out alive. The damaged bomber was slow, dropping altitude inch by inch despite every adjustment. Bragg's arms ached. His hands had gone numb around the yoke, but he didn't dare loosen his grip. The controls felt heavy, unresponsive, like dragging a dead weight through the sky. His back burned from the effort, yet his face stayed calm, eyes locked on the horizon. Co-pilot Engel kept one hand on the throttles, constantly tuning engine power to keep vibration low. The two men didn't talk anymore. They simply understood. From time to time, a violent tremor shook the plane. The fuselage groaned, the tail flexing dangerously. Every time it happened, the crew froze. They waited for the sound of metal tearing, but it never came. After each moment of chaos, the bomber steadied again, as if determined to hold together a little longer. When they reached the Mediterranean, the sea looked endless. The clouds thickened. For a brief moment, a flight of German fighters appeared on the horizon, black dots cutting across the blue. The crew tensed, fingers tightening on their guns, but the fighters didn't attack. They circled once, slowly, then peeled away. Maybe they were out of ammunition. Maybe they recognized what they were looking at. A machine already sentenced to die, limping home on nothing but stubbornness. Inside the bomber, time lost all meaning. The temperature dropped, frost gathering on the inside of the cockpit glass. The air was thin and sharp, burning their lungs with every breath. Engel glanced at Bragg, but the pilot didn't look away from the horizon. His focus was absolute. He wasn't flying anymore. He was willing the aircraft forward. And for 90 minutes, the All-American obeyed him, defying logic, gravity, and everything the sky was supposed to allow. The coast of Algeria finally appeared on the horizon, a faint line of sand and sunlight through the haze. 90 minutes had passed since the collision, though to the crew it felt like an eternity. Bragg exhaled slowly, his arms stiff, his gloves soaked with sweat. He'd kept the All-American alive for as long as any man could. Now came the part he'd been dreading, bringing her back down. The base had been alerted by radio an hour earlier. The controller's voice cracked through the static. "All-American, you're cleared for emergency landing. Runway is clear. Godspeed." The entire field waited. Mechanics, medics, pilots, all watching the sky for a bomber they weren't sure would make it back. Bragg began his descent in tiny increments, 100 feet at a time. Each drop in altitude brought denser air, and denser air meant pressure, the kind that could tear the broken fuselage apart. The All-American groaned as it entered the thicker atmosphere, the sound deep and animal, like a ship straining against a storm. Inside the cockpit, loose panels rattled. In the waist section, the men could see the tail flexing wildly. Through the gap in the fuselage, Weaver braced himself against the walls of the tail compartment, every shudder a reminder that the airframe was seconds from failure. No one spoke. The only sound was the steady rhythm of the engines and the low moan of metal giving way. At 10,000 feet, Bragg felt the plane start to yaw. He eased it back, breathing slow, hands feather light on the controls. "Easy now," he murmured. Engel adjusted the throttles, keeping power balanced. The airspeed dropped. Too much, and they'd stall. Too little, and they'd tear apart. It was a razor's edge, and Bragg balanced it like a man walking a wire over an abyss. The runway came into view. Ambulances and fire trucks lined the sides. Men stood with their helmets in their hands, eyes fixed on the bomber limping toward them. Bragg called over the radio, voice steady but quiet. "We're coming in, nice and slow." He brought the bomber in level, the desert wind pushing lightly against her wings. The ground rose beneath them, closer, closer, until the wheels met the dirt with a soft, reluctant kiss. The All-American touched down perfectly, rolling straight down the runway at barely above stall speed. No bounce, no skid, just a long, gentle glide. Bragg eased off the throttles, letting her slow naturally. The crew exhaled together, some laughing, some crying, no one speaking. For a brief, beautiful moment, it was over. Then, at 30 miles per hour, the tail finally gave up. The metal frame sagged, cracked, and folded to the ground with a heavy scrape, sliding to a stop behind the rest of the fuselage. The All-American had done everything a machine could do, and a little more. It had held together just long enough to bring them home. When the engines finally stopped turning, the airfield fell silent. For a few seconds, no one moved. The crew stepped out into the sunlight, weak and shaking, their faces pale beneath the grime. Behind them, the All-American sat motionless, the wind tugging at the shredded edges of her fuselage. What had once been a bomber now looked more like wreckage delivered by a miracle. Within minutes, engineers and mechanics surrounded the aircraft. They spoke in low voices, walking around her like men examining something sacred. One by one, they began counting. Ruptured panels, snapped rivets, cracked beams. The numbers kept climbing. 200 separate points of structural failure. Oxygen lines severed, control cables hanging by threads. Of the 4 main beams that made up the bomber's spine, 3 were completely cut through. The 4th was halfway torn. The engineer's final report put it into words that no one could quite believe. The aircraft's flight represents a statistical impossibility. When word reached Boeing, a team of company engineers flew out to Algeria to study the wreck firsthand. They walked around it for hours, touching the torn aluminum and the remaining beam that had somehow carried the weight of an entire aircraft. One of them shook his head and said quietly, "We built her to take punishment, not to survive this." Photographs were taken from every angle. The gaping wound, the missing section, the dangling cables. They were sent back to the States, where they spread through training centers and briefing rooms as proof of what the flying fortress could endure. Even captured German pilots, who later saw the photos, refused to believe them. Some said the images were fakes, propaganda. When told they were real, one Luftwaffe officer stared for a long moment before saying, "This is why you will win. You build machines that refuse to die." From that day on, the All-American was no longer just a bomber. It was a legend, a story whispered across hangars and mess halls. Proof that sometimes courage, precision, and luck could hold the sky together when everything else had already fallen apart. Years later, when the war was long over and most of his crew had gone their separate ways, Lieutenant Kendrick, Sonny Bragg, rarely spoke about that day. When reporters or fellow pilots asked, he always answered the same way, with a modest smile and a shake of his head. "It wasn't me," he'd say. "It was the crew, the engineers, and a lot of luck." But the men who had flown beside him knew better. They remembered the voice that never wavered, the hands that never trembled, the calm in a sky that had come apart around them. They knew that what held the All-American together that day wasn't luck or mathematics. It was Bragg himself, steady, quiet, and unwilling to surrender to what should have been inevitable. The All-American was scrapped soon after the landing. Her pieces were used to repair other bombers still flying missions over Europe. But her story refused to fade. Photographs of her shattered fuselage were pinned to briefing room walls across the Air Corps. Pilots who saw them would pause, shake their heads, and say only one thing: how? The answer was simple. 3 broken beams, a handful of cables, and one man who refused to give up. The wreck was gone, but its lesson endured. Some aircraft are built to fly. Others are built to remind us why we do.